A wing nearly as wide as a modern airliner's. 4 engines, and 4 turbochargers that let them breathe almost 5 miles up, where the air itself gives out. 10 men sealed inside an unpressurized aluminum tube, carried to the very edge of the survivable sky. Before the Flying Fortress was a legend, it was a set of engineering decisions, and we are going to take every one of them apart, one system at a time. We begin with the machine itself, its size, its structure, and the engines that made all the rest of it possible. "25,000 feet over Germany, the air is 40 degrees below zero, and there is no way out but forward. Look at what is coming toward them. A formation of flying fortresses, hundreds of them, stacked in tight boxes across the sky, engines hammering, vapor streaming from more than 1,000 propellers, and along every fuselage the barrels of heavy machine guns tracking for movement. This was the sight that was supposed to end the argument before it began. A self-defending armada, flying in daylight, straight to the enemy's heart. The machine that would make the idea of fighting the United States look like madness. Then, the fighters come. Not from behind, where the guns are waiting, from dead ahead, head-on, closing at the combined speed of both aircraft, so fast the gunners have barely a heartbeat to fire. Cannon shells walk across a bomber's nose. An engine trails fire. A fortress falls out of formation, and there is nothing the others can do but hold course and keep flying, because the formation is the only defense they have, and to break it is to die alone. The men inside are fighting 2 enemies at once. One wears a fighter, the other is the cold and the thin air, and a machine that has carried them to a place the human body was never meant to survive. This is the aircraft that was built on a theory, and this is the story of what happened when that theory met a sky that fought back. This is the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was the machine that carried American air power to the heart of Nazi Germany, and the symbol of a doctrine that promised the bomber could win a war on its own. It existed to answer a question that had haunted military thinkers since the last war. Could a heavily armed bomber, flying high and in formation, defend itself against fighters and strike precisely enough to break an enemy from the air? America bet that it could. Boeing bet its own survival on building the aircraft that would prove it. We have modeled the B-17 in intricate detail to showcase both the features that made it legendary and the flaws that shaped its reputation. In this video, we focus on the definitive version, the B-17G, the most produced fortress of all, and we will trace how it got there. To understand the Flying Fortress, you have to understand the idea it was built to serve, because the idea came first. In the years after the First World War, a belief took hold among airmen on both sides of the Atlantic that the bomber had changed war forever. In 1932, Britain's Stanley Baldwin told Parliament that the bomber will always get through, that no defense could reliably stop a determined bomber force, and that the only protection was the threat of striking back harder. He said it in a disarmament debate, not as Air Force doctrine, but the phrase captured the age. The bomber was the weapon that made distance meaningless, and it was meant to be feared. In the United States, that belief took a specific and confident form. American airmen argued that a bomber could not merely reach its target, but destroy it with precision, in daylight, from high altitude, using a bombsight so accurate it made pinpoint strikes possible. And they argued that if bombers flew in tight formation, their combined defensive guns would form a box of fire no fighter could survive. Put those two ideas together, and you have the whole American theory of strategic air power, the self-defending formation and daylight precision bombing. No escort needed, no coastline safe. It was an elegant theory. It was also, in both of its load-bearing premises, about to be tested against reality, and the men who wrote it knew more than they let on. When American planners drew up their air war plan in 1941, their own arithmetic told them that a single bomber at 20,000 feet had barely a 1% chance of putting a bomb on a 100-foot target, and that it would take around 220 bombers to be 90% sure of a single hit. The doctrine's authors knew the numbers before the first mission flew. They believed the theory anyway. The aircraft that would carry that theory began, as these things often do, with a bureaucratic request. In the summer of 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps asked for a new bomber to replace its aging designs, one that could carry a ton of bombs 2,000 miles at better than 200 miles an hour. The specification used the word multi-engined. What the Air Corps meant by that word was 2 engines. Twin-engine bombers were cheaper, simpler, and exactly what the budget expected. Boeing looked at the requirement and made a decision that would define the entire aircraft and nearly destroy the company. It built a bomber with 4 engines. 4 engines meant more power, more altitude, more range, and more weight of guns, everything the strategic bombing theory demanded. It also meant far more cost and a direct gamble against what the Air Corps had actually asked for. This is the founding bet of the Flying Fortress, a company wagering that the future belonged to the big 4-engine bomber against a customer that meant something smaller and cheaper. Boeing would pay for that bet out of its own treasury. They called it the Model 299. On the 26th of September, 1934, Boeing's board voted to spend $275,000 of the company's own money to build the prototype, and later added another $150,000. By the time it was finished, it had cost the company $432,000, an enormous sum for a firm whose employment had already fallen from 1,700 workers to 600. This was not a funded government program. This was a company betting its life. The aircraft that rolled out in the summer of 1935 was so large and so heavily armed for its day that a reporter for the Seattle Times, looking at the gun positions bristling from its fuselage, described it in a photo caption as a flying fortress. The name stuck. It flew for the first time on the 28th of July, 1935, with Boeing's chief test pilot, Leslie Tower, at the controls, and it was magnificent, faster and longer ranged than anything the twin-engine competition could offer. Then, on the 30th of October, 1935, it crashed on takeoff at Wright Field and burned. Major Ployer Hill, the Army pilot at the controls, was killed. Leslie Tower, who had helped build it, died of his injuries weeks later. The cause was heartbreakingly simple. The aircraft had an internal lock on its elevator and rudder controls, engaged on the ground to stop the surfaces flapping in the wind. On that flight, it was still engaged at takeoff. The crew tried to fly an aircraft that could not respond, stalled, and went in. Here, the legend and the record part ways for the first time. The story is often told that the pilot's checklist was invented that day, born from this crash. That is not quite true. The idea of a written checklist had been around for decades, in scattered use across aviation. What the Model 299 crash did was force an institution to adopt it, to make it standard, mandatory, unskippable. The crash did not invent the checklist, it institutionalized it. And that distinction turns out to be the whole story of this aircraft, as we will see. For now, the crash had a more immediate consequence. With the prototype destroyed, the Air Corps turned to the cheaper option. It bought 133 twin-engine Douglas B-18s against just 13 of Boeing's Fortresses. And the reason, according to the Air Force's own official history, was money. The General Staff directed that the funds be spent on the cheaper aircraft. At a production quantity of 220, a B-18 cost about $58,500. A Fortress cost nearly $100,000. Boeing had built the better aircraft, won the competition on merit, and lost the contract on price. What saved the Flying Fortress was not the airplane. It was the war and something quieter, the learning curve. When mass production finally came, the cost of building each aircraft collapsed as workers grew skilled. At Boeing's Great Seattle plant, the direct labor needed to build one Fortress fell from nearly 143,000 man-hours in September 1941 to just over 15,000 by August 1944, an 89% reduction. Across 3 companies working together, Boeing, Douglas, and Vega, the pool built 12,731 Fortresses. The aircraft that had nearly bankrupted its maker in peacetime became affordable only when it was needed by the tens of thousands. The Flying Fortress was a large aircraft, but not an enormous one. It measured 74 feet 9 inches, 22.78 meters long, stood 19 feet 1 inch, 5.82 meters tall on the ground, and spanned 103 feet 9 inches, 31.62 meters across the wings, a wingspan only a few feet shorter than a modern airliner. Empty, a B-17G weighed around 36,000 pounds, 16,300 kilograms. Its normal maximum takeoff weight was 65,000 pounds, 29,500 kilograms, and if pushed to its absolute limit, every fuel tank full, every rack loaded, it could stagger into the air at up to 72,000 pounds, 32,700 kilograms. The skin of the aircraft was stressed aluminum alloy, and it was thin, around a 50th of an inch, 0.5 millimeters in many places. But thin skin did not mean a fragile aircraft. Beneath it lay a robust structure. The fuselage, reinforced with frames and long stringers called longerons, and the wings built around a twin longeron design braced by internal trusses, covered first with corrugated aluminum and then the outer skin. The control surfaces were skinned in doped fabric to save weight. The result was a structure that was genuinely hard to break, and that reputation for toughness would become one of the aircraft's most enduring legends. We will test that legend against the numbers later.
The fuselage was built in numbered sections, each a distinct module. At the nose was the bombardier's and navigator station, glazed in plexiglass. Behind it, the flight deck for the pilot and co-pilot, with the powered dorsal turret on top. Then the bomb bay, then the radio compartment and the ball turret beneath the fuselage, then the waist section with its 2 gun positions, and finally the tail, with the tail gunner's position at the very back. The Fortress was flown and fought by a crew of 10. The pilot commanded. The co-pilot backed him and monitored the engines. The engineer managed the aircraft's systems and manned the top turret. The navigator charted the course home through hundreds of miles of hostile sky and could man a gun when the fighters came. The bombardier had one task above all others: to place the bombs on the target. And every other role on the aircraft ultimately served that single purpose. The radio operator kept the aircraft in contact and manned a gun of his own, and several dedicated gunners defended the Fortress at the waist windows, in the ball turret, and in the tail. Everything about the Flying Fortress, its altitude, its reach, its survival, and its suffering, traces back to 4 engines and the devices bolted to them. The aircraft was powered by 4 Wright R1820 Cyclone radials, each a 9-cylinder air-cooled engine producing around 1,200 horsepower, and briefly up to nearly 1,400 under wartime emergency power. On their own, those engines would have gasped and faded as the aircraft climbed, because the air at altitude is too thin to make full power. So each engine was fed by a General Electric turbo supercharger, a turbine spun by the engine's own exhaust gases that rammed compressed air into the cylinders.
This is the system that made the whole aircraft possible. The turbo superchargers let the engines hold near sea-level power into the mid-20,000s of feet, which is what allowed the Fortress to fly and fight at altitudes where enemy fighters struggled and flak was less accurate. High-altitude daylight bombing existed because of these devices. And here is the trade-off that defines everything that follows. The same system that lifted 10 men to 25,000 feet also stranded them there, in an open, unpressurized aluminum tube, in air 40 degrees below zero for hours at a time. The turbo supercharger did not just make the mission possible, it created almost every other problem in this story. One more thing about those 4 engines, because it still kills fortresses in our own time. A B-17 flying on 3 engines is not simply a 4-engine aircraft with 1 fewer. When the aircraft is slow, heavy, and configured for landing, the drag of a dead engine on one side tries to twist the aircraft around, and if that force is mishandled, no amount of structural toughness will save it. Remember that. We will come back to it at the very end. If the turbo supercharger was the aircraft's engine of possibility, the Norden bombsight was the heart of its promise. The Norden was a mechanical analog computer coupled to the aircraft's autopilot. The bombardier fed it the altitude, the airspeed, and the drift, then tracked the target through a stabilized telescope until the crosshairs stopped drifting, at which point the sight itself flew the aircraft through the release and dropped the bombs at the calculated instant. On a calm practice range, in clear air, it worked remarkably well. It was the physical embodiment of the precision bombing theory, and it was guarded like a state secret. It was even withheld from Britain, whose early fortresses flew with an inferior sight. The marketing around it was extravagant, talk of dropping a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The reality of combat was different, and the difference is the single most important operational fact about this aircraft. In combat, the Norden faced flak-induced evasive maneuvering, unknown high-altitude winds, the contrails of the aircraft ahead, and cloud that hid the target entirely. And from 1943, to concentrate the bombing, the whole formation stopped aiming individually. Instead, only the lead bombardier aimed. When he released, every other aircraft in the box dropped on his signal. So, precision bombing, in practice, was not dozens of individual aiming solutions. It was one solution per formation, multiplied across dozens of aircraft that simply toggled their loads on the leader's release. And when cloud forced the bombers to aim by radar instead of by eye, precision collapsed. By October 1944, when 8th Air Force bombs were aimed visually, about 41% fell within 1,000 feet of the target. Using radar or radio aids alone, that figure, in the words of one analysis, plummeted to a miserable 5%. The self-defending formation depended on guns, and over the course of the war the fortress grew more and more of them. The great transformation came with the B-17E. It added the tail gunner's position, enlarged the fin for stability, and introduced powered gun turrets, one on top, one beneath the belly. That fixed the aircraft's rear. Anything approaching from behind flew into a wall of fire. But it did not fix the nose, and the Luftwaffe found the gap. German pilots learned to attack head-on, in level flight, straight into the front of the formation, the one direction the early fortresses could barely defend, and the direction where the closing speed of the two aircraft gave the bombers' gunners almost no time to aim. It was a brutal, dangerous tactic for the fighter pilots too, but it worked. The answer, on the definitive B-17G, was a remotely sighted chin turret, 2 more heavy machine guns slung under the nose, aimed by the bombardier, finally closing the head-on hole. With it, the B-17G carried 13 heavy machine guns in all. The chin turret, cheek guns, the top turret, the ball turret, the waist guns, and the tail. On paper, a fortress indeed. Beneath the fuselage hung the most infamous position on the aircraft, the Sperry ball turret. A small man was folded into a sphere barely larger than himself, knees to his chest, spinning below the belly of the aircraft with 2 heavy machine guns and the ammunition packed in around him. Crews consistently reported that the standard chest parachute could not be worn inside the ball. The gunner hung it in the fuselage above him, and to reach it, he had to rotate the turret and climb out. That testimony is credible and widely repeated, though it is testimony rather than official doctrine, so we treat it as what the men themselves said. But there is a story told about the ball turret so often that it has hardened into fact, that it was the deadliest place to sit in the aircraft. The record does not support it. In a detailed survey of 8th Air Force battle casualties across the summer of 1944, the ball turret had the lowest casualty rate of any crew position, under 6% of all casualties. The most dangerous positions were the waist guns, standing exposed at those open, freezing windows, at over 20%. The ball turret was cramped, isolating, and genuinely terrifying. It was not, by the numbers that survive, the most dangerous seat on the aircraft. If you have seen casualty figures that show otherwise, we would like to see them. Let us know in the comments. The fortress carried armor plate, positioned to shield the crew and critical systems from shrapnel and machine gun fire. It was thin manganese steel, mounted on rubber padding, and it was never meant to stop a direct hit from a heavy cannon shell, only to give the men inside a fighting chance against fragments and lighter fire. Against the 20mm and 30mm cannon the Luftwaffe increasingly used, it could only do so much. The fortress carried its fuel in the wings, 6 main tanks holding around 1,700 U.S. gallons, 6,435 liters, with engines drawing from tanks on their own side and an electric pump able to transfer fuel from wing to wing. For the long penetrations into Germany, that was not enough, so the aircraft was fitted with what crews called Tokyo tanks, 18 self-collapsible fuel cells, 9 in each wing, adding around 1,000 more gallons and feeding the main tanks by gravity. For maximum range, an auxiliary tank in the bomb bay could push the total to around 3,600 gallons, 13,600 liters. The main tanks were self-sealing, and the mechanism was elegant. Each tank was a sandwich, a metal outer shell around layers of rubber that reacted to gasoline. When a bullet punched through, fuel reached the rubber, which swelled and closed the wound around the hole. A leak that would have doomed the aircraft sealed itself. The Tokyo tanks, though, came with a trade-off. To save weight, they lacked the outer metal skin. They were essentially thick, self-sealing bags tucked into the wing. And an emptying fuel tank fills with vapor, and vapor can explode. The extra range came with extra risk, carried right inside the wings. Now we come to the part of this story that almost every telling leaves out, and it is the most important part of all. At 25,000 feet, the air will not keep a man conscious, and the cold will kill him. The fortress answered both with equipment that was, by our standards, primitive. Demand oxygen masks that fed the crew air as they breathed, and electrically heated suits wired like an electric blanket. When both worked, a man could function. When they failed, the failures were mundane and lethal. A mask could freeze from the moisture of a man's own breath. A heated suit's wiring could break, and the man inside would begin, slowly, to freeze. And a gunner clearing a jammed weapon might strip off his gloves for 30 seconds in air 40 degrees below zero, and lose his fingers for it. The numbers are staggering, and they are better documented than almost anything else about this aircraft. In the 14 months ending in December 1943, 1,634 men were removed from flying duty in the 8th Air Force because of cold injuries suffered on high-altitude missions. Over the very same period, 1,207 were removed because of wounds from enemy action. The cold took more men off flying status than the enemy did. Let us be precise, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets a documentary corrected. That figure counts men removed from flying duty, not men killed. It does not say the cold killed more men than flak. What it says is that the aircraft's most punishing enemy, measured by how many crewmen it took out of the fight, was not the Luftwaffe at all. It was the environment the aircraft carried them into. The largest single cause was wind blast, the freezing hurricane that tore through an open waist window, accounting for 39% of cold injuries in that period, and rising toward 55% the following year. Alongside it ran the risk of oxygen failure. At 30,000 feet, a displaced mask meant unconsciousness in about a minute. The Flying Fortress did not need to be shot down to take a man out of the war. It only needed a broken wire, or a jammed gun, and 30 seconds of bare skin. Every mission began, now, with a checklist. The discipline born from that 1935 crash made permanent. The pilot activated the master switch, bringing the electrical system to life. The co-pilot engaged the batteries and inverters. The parking brakes were checked, the booster pumps verified, the carburetor filters opened for clean air, the fuel quantity confirmed across every tank. Then, the engines were started in sequence, 1 to 4, and brought into synchronization. Instruments were checked, the radio brought up, the turbo superchargers and propellers exercised, the generators tested, and only then, trim set, tail wheel locked, gyros aligned, was the aircraft ready to roll. Then came the part no checklist could make safe. Deep over enemy territory, as the formation approached the target, the pilot engaged the autopilot and handed the aircraft to the bombardier. The bomb bay doors came open, and for the length of the bomb run, the Fortress flew straight, level, and utterly predictable. Because the Norden demanded a steady platform, and a steady platform is exactly what the flak gunners on the ground were praying for. It was the most dangerous stretch of the entire mission, and it could not be avoided because there was no other way to aim. Defense was a matter of coordination, spoken over the intercom in the language of a clock face. 12 o'clock was dead ahead, 6 o'clock directly behind, and every gunner knew his arc. When the call came, "Bandits, 6 o'clock high," the tail gunner, the top turret, and the ball turret swung to meet an attack from behind and above. A call of 3 o'clock low turned the ball turret and the right waist gun onto the threat. 10 aircraft flying wingtip to wingtip, hundreds of guns, all directed by a running commentary of numbers on a clock. And in the chaos, the cold, and the terror of a running fight, aircraft flying that close together sometimes fired into one another. The self-defending formation had a cost written into its very design. Through 1942 and into 1943, the 8th Air Force built its strength in England and pushed its daylight raids deeper into occupied Europe and then into Germany itself. The formations were disciplined, the guns were many, and the crews believed, because they had been told and because they had to, that a tight box of fortresses could fight its way to any target and back. Then came the autumn of 1943, and in the space of 8 weeks, the theory was falsified in public. On the 17th of August, 1943, 376 fortresses set out to strike deep into Germany. The aircraft factories at Regensburg and the ball bearing works at Schweinfurt, the heart of German industry. 60 of them were shot down. 1 in 6 dispatched and never coming home. The 8th went back to Schweinfurt on the 14th of October.
It is remembered as Black Thursday. Of 291 fortresses dispatched, 60 were shot down over Europe. Of the survivors that reached England, 17 more were so badly damaged they crashed on landing or were scrapped. 77 aircraft lost or written off in a single day, with 121 more needing repair. And note that number carefully, because it is another place documentaries go wrong. 60 were shot down. 77 were lost or written off. They are not the same figure. After Black Thursday, the deep, unescorted raids stopped. Not out of cowardice and not in a total stand-down, the 8th kept bombing targets within reach of its fighters. But the long, unescorted penetrations into the heart of Germany, the missions that were supposed to prove the whole theory, halted for just over 4 months. A force that must stop flying is not self-defending. The central premise of American air doctrine had been tested against a defended sky, and it had failed.
The Luftwaffe had not beaten the flying fortress by being tougher. It had beaten the theory wrapped around it. By finding the head-on hole, by massing fighters, by attacking with cannon and rockets from beyond the range of the bomber's machine guns. The self-defending formation was defeated by an enemy that simply refused to attack the way the theory assumed. And the fix, when it came, was not a better bomber. This is the turn that matters, and it is not the one most documentaries reach for. The satisfying version of the story is that the P-51 Mustang arrived, a long-range escort fighter that could go all the way to the target and back, and swept the sky clear. The Mustang was indeed decisive. But the thing that actually let the escorts reach Schweinfurt was more humble than any wonder fighter. It was a sheet metal fuel tank. Production of the 150-gallon drop tank for the P-47 rose from around 300 a month in September 1943 to 22,000 a month by December. A disposable tank of pressed steel, produced in enormous numbers, extended the reach of fighters that already existed, and with the Mustang and a change in how the escorts were used, the bombers finally had company all the way in. In late February 1944, the 8th returned to the deep targets in force in a series of raids remembered as Big Week. Nearly 4,000 heavy bomber sorties in 6 days, escorted the whole way. And now the equation inverted. The German fighters that rose to attack the bombers were themselves attacked by the escorts and shot down faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe's own fighter commander, Adolf Galland, later admitted that in the last 4 months of that struggle, his force lost over 1,000 pilots. And archival records suggest he understated it. The Luftwaffe was not bombed to death on the ground. It was destroyed in the air in the first months of 1944 by the fighters that came to protect the bombers. So let us be honest about this aircraft, because the legend and the record do not match, and the honesty is the point. Start with precision, the very promise the fortress was built to keep. The most damning verdict comes not from any critic, but from the United States' own post-war audit, the Strategic Bombing Survey, the Air Forces investigating themselves. Its finding, in its own words, in the overall, only about 20% of the bombs aimed at precision targets fell within this target area, a circle 1,000 feet across around the aiming point. Only about 1 bomb in 5 landed even within that generous circle. And of the doctrine's showcase target, the ball-bearing industry, the same survey concluded that the attacks had no measurable effect on essential war production. To be fair, and we will not cherry-pick, accuracy improved dramatically late in the war, reaching a peak of around 70% within the target circle by February 1945, once the Luftwaffe was gone and the crews could aim in peace. Both numbers are true. But across the campaign, precision bombing was a doctrine and an aspiration far more than it was a measured capability. Then there is the cold, which we have already counted. More men removed from duty by the environment than by the enemy in the campaign's hardest 14 months. That is the aircraft's binding constraint, and it was physiological, not aerodynamic. And then there is the toughness legend, the belief that the Fortress could absorb damage no other bomber could, that it was tougher than its stablemate, the B-24 Liberator. The crews who flew it swore by it, and their testimony is real and consistent. But the aggregate numbers do not show it. By the 8th Air Force's own statistics, the B-17 was lost at about 1.87% per sortie, against the B-24's 1.59%. The Fortress rate was, if anything, slightly higher. Now, that comparison is badly confounded. The Fortresses flew the deepest, most heavily defended raids, while the Liberators flew many lower-risk missions, and whole B-24 groups converted to Fortresses during the war. Neither side of that argument wins cleanly. But the plain fact is this. The Fortress's legendary toughness, real as it felt to the men inside, is simply not visible in the loss statistics. One thing the record does bear out without qualification: the 8th Air Force's losses were appalling. Its casualties were among the heaviest borne by any American formation of the war, and its loss rate on a bad mission was worse than almost anything else American forces endured. That much needs no exaggeration. The truth is grim enough. The Flying Fortress reached its final form by a long process of patching what combat exposed. The early models, the B-17C and D, went to war underarmed, and the lesson was brutal. When Britain flew a handful of early Fortresses in 1941, they had no powered turrets at all, only handheld guns. The guns and oil froze at altitude, the Astrodome iced over, and roughly half the sorties aborted. Britain gave up on daylight fortress operations within months. The B-17E answered with the tailgun and the powered turrets. The B-17F refined the airframe and extended the range. And the B-17G closed the last great gap with its chin turret, becoming the definitive version, the one built in the greatest numbers, and the one most people picture when they hear the name. So what did the Flying Fortress actually change? And was the fear it was meant to inspire ever real? Here is the honest reckoning. The aircraft was superb. The doctrine it was built to serve was wrong in both of its founding premises. The self-defending formation was falsified over Schweinfurt. Precision bombing, by the Air Force's own measurement, mostly missed. And what finally broke the Luftwaffe was not a better bomber, but a system assembled around it. Drop tanks, the Mustang, and a change in escort tactics. The capability the theory placed inside the bomber turned out to live in the network around it. Twice, in fact. First in 1935, when the answer to the aircraft's complexity was a checklist, and again in 1943, when the answer to the defended sky was the escort. Boeing built a magnificent machine. Both times, what actually mattered lived outside it. But there is a harder, more interesting possibility, and an honest verdict has to sit with it. If the bombs mostly missed and the bottleneck theory failed, then perhaps the campaign's real value was never the destruction of targets at all. Perhaps its decisive product was something the doctrine never intended, forcing the German fighter force to rise into the air to be destroyed, and draining the Reich of the resources it needed to survive the bombing. Thousands of heavy anti-aircraft guns pointed at the sky instead of at Soviet tanks. Hundreds of thousands of men manning flak batteries and clearing rubble. Fighter production forced toward defense and away from attack. Measured that way, the Fortress may have won not as a precision weapon, but as bait, and as a burden the enemy could not carry. Which brings us back to the title, and to fear. The The Flying Fortress became the symbol of American strategic air power, the machine that put the country's reach and its threat over the whole of Europe. That fear was real, but the way the aircraft actually earned its place in the war was stranger and harder than the legend, and the men who flew it paid for it in a cold, defended sky, executing a doctrine that had quietly been proven wrong beneath them, and prevailing anyway. The fear was deserved. The reasons for it were not the ones anyone expected. 12,731 Flying Fortresses were built. As of August 2026, 3 are still flying anywhere in the world. 3. The Commemorative Air Force's Sentimental Journey, Ericsson's Ye Olde Pub, and Sally B at Duxford in England. Others sit grounded, one static since 2024, with cracks in its wing spar, the whole small fleet living under the shadow of inspections that keep finding metal fatigue in aircraft 80 years old. One was lost outright in a crash at an air show in 2022. And the machine still teaches its oldest lesson. In October 2019, a Flying Fortress named 909 crashed on approach in Connecticut, killing 7 of the 13 people aboard. The engine failure that started it was survivable. What was not survivable, in the words of the accident report, was the pilot's failure to properly manage the airplane's configuration and airspeed after he shut down the number 4 engine. A dead engine on one side, an aircraft slow and heavy and dirty, and the same twisting force that has been waiting in this design since 1935. Toughness was never what killed fortresses. It was the reach of a single mind against a complex machine. The same lesson as Black Thursday, and the same lesson as the crash that killed Major Hill. 12,731 built. 3 flying. The scarcity is the ending. If you want to climb inside the most infamous position on this aircraft, take a look at our dedicated video on the ball turret, the myths, the mechanism, and what it was really like to fly beneath the belly of a fortress into a defended sky. If you spotted any errors, please let us know in the comments. On an aircraft this wrapped in legend, we mean it, and we are always looking to improve. And if you would like to support work like this, you can find us on Patreon. Thank you for watching.